Dona Rosa had seen more than most in her 95 years. She had survived revolutions, economic collapses, and the slow, creeping modernization that had swallowed neighboring towns. But nothing compared to the war that now came knocking at her door. For years, she had watched the cartel's influence grow in the region, young men disappearing into the ranks, returning with money, guns, and the cold, hollow eyes of those who had seen too much. Yet, she had remained untouched, an old woman, tending to her land, her cows, and the soil that had fed her family for generations. But now, the cartel wanted that land, and they had no patience for refusal. It started with a letter, slipped under her heavy wooden door in the dead of night. The paper was crisp, the words scrawled in an impatient, almost careless script. Sell the land or suffer the consequences. You have 3 days. There was no signature, no name, but Dona Rosa knew exactly who had sent it. The rumors had been swirling for months. El Cayman, the regional cartel leader, was buying up land at an alarming rate. Some families took the money and ran. Others simply vanished. And now, the cartel had turned their gaze on her. Dona Rosa didn't flinch. She had spent nearly a century on this land. Her father had worked these fields. Her children had been born under the roof of her adobe house, and her late husband's ashes were scattered beneath the towering ceiba tree at the heart of her farm. To leave was unthinkable. She crumpled the letter, tossing it into the fireplace where the flames licked it away into nothing. The next morning, she found her cows slaughtered. The sight was brutal. Necks slit, their lifeless bodies sprawled in the golden morning light. Flies buzzed around the blood-soaked dirt. It was a message, a warning, and an invitation to fear. But Dona Rosa refused to be afraid. Instead, she pulled on her worn-out boots, took a deep breath of the cool morning air, and began digging a fresh grave to bury them, whispering apologies to each one as she worked. Word spread fast in the small town. Neighbors arrived, some to help, others just to watch in hushed horror. No one spoke the cartel's name aloud, but their presence loomed over every conversation. Dona Rosa, a younger farmer, Mateo, whispered, his eyes darting nervously around. You have to leave. You can't fight them. She wiped the sweat from her brow, giving him a long, measured look. This land is my life. I will not run. By nightfall, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The cartel wasn't done proving their point. At midnight, a truck roared down the dirt road leading to her home, headlights flashing wildly. A group of men, their faces obscured by bandanas, jumped out. With ruthless efficiency, they set her barn ablaze, the drywood catching fire almost instantly. The flames climbed high into the sky, licking at the darkness with violent hunger. Dona Rosa stood by her porch, gripping the rosary in her hands. She did not cry, did not beg. Instead, she watched, her expression unreadable. The cartel men expected panic, fear, maybe even pleading. What they got was silence. One of the younger enforcers, barely in his 20s, hesitated as he met her gaze. For a fleeting moment, something wavered in his eyes, guilt, uncertainty, maybe even respect. But it was gone just as quickly. The truck's engine roared again, and the men disappeared into the night, leaving only smoke and destruction behind. The town woke to the sight of Dona Rosa's ruined barn, but she had already begun cleaning the wreckage, her movements slow but steady. People whispered, their fear of the cartel clashing with their awe for the old woman who refused to bow. They won't stop, Mateo told her again, more insistent this time. They'll kill you, Dona Rosa. She only smiled, her weathered hands resting on the wooden staff she always carried. Not yet, Mijo. The next day, the threats escalated. Her fences were torn down. Her water supply was cut off, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the cartel took even bolder steps. The town's mayor, a cowardly man who had long since sold his loyalty, paid her a visit. You have to be reasonable, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. You're old, Dona Rosa. Take the money and go somewhere safe. She fixed him with a gaze so piercing that he shifted uncomfortably. "Safe?" she echoed. "There is no safety in running." The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples. "El Cayman doesn't like to be refused. You have until tomorrow. If you don't leave, he'll send someone who won't just burn your barn." Dona Rosa remained silent. That night, she sat on her porch, staring up at the stars. Her wrinkled fingers traced the surface of an old rotary phone she hadn't used in years. She had been waiting for the right moment. Now, it had arrived. With deliberate slowness, she dialed a number she had not called in decades. The line rang once, twice, before a deep voice answered on the other end. "It's been a long time," the voice said, filled with quiet authority. "Too long," Dona Rosa replied. "I need a favor." A pause. Then a chuckle. "I owe you my life, Vieja. Say the word." She exhaled, the weight of the years pressing down on her. But for the first time in days, she felt something new. A shift in the wind, a turning of the tide. "The cartel thinks they own this town," she said. "I need you to remind them who really does." The line went dead. But Dona Rosa knew, by sunrise, everything would change. The night was heavy with silence, but Dona Rosa knew the storm was coming. After she made the call, she sat on her porch, staring at the horizon, waiting. The wind carried the scent of burnt wood from her barn, but she didn't let the smell of destruction shake her resolve. Somewhere beyond the hills, the cartel was preparing its next move, unaware that the game had already changed. Morning came, and with it, a shift in the town's atmosphere. People moved cautiously, their eyes darting to the road that led in and out of their sleepy town. They had seen the cartel's violence before, but they had never seen anyone defy them the way Dona Rosa had. The fear was palpable, but so was the anticipation. Then the first sign arrived. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into town just before noon. Unlike the cartel's usual presence, noisy, reckless, full of swagger, these vehicles moved with eerie precision, their windows tinted so dark that they seemed like moving voids. The cartel had always made a spectacle of their power, but this was something else entirely. The town watched from behind curtains and half-closed doors. The SUVs didn't stop at the mayor's office or the police station, places where deals were made and bribes exchanged. Instead, they went straight to El Cayman's compound on the outskirts of town. A fortress of concrete walls, steel gates, and armed men, it had long stood as a symbol of his untouchable rule. Inside the compound, El Cayman sat at the head of a large wooden table, his patience wearing thin. He had been expecting a call from his men, confirmation that the old woman's land was no longer her concern. Instead, he received something much more unsettling, a call from his own superior. "You're to leave her alone." The voice on the other end had said, calm but firm. El Cayman didn't like being told what to do. He had clawed his way to the top, carving out his own empire through blood and fear. But even men like him answered to someone. And that someone was Senor Blanco, the kind of man whose name was never spoken out loud unless absolutely necessary. With all due respect, El Cayman had replied carefully, "This is my territory. The old woman is not to be touched." The voice cut in, sharper this time. "And neither is her land." El Cayman felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. Understood? Now, as the convoy arrived at his doorstep, El Cayman stepped outside to greet his visitors, though he knew better than to call them guests. His men stiffened as the car doors opened, revealing figures dressed in tailored suits. Not cartel soldiers, but something worse. Blanco's men. The kind that never made noise until it was necessary. The kind that didn't come to negotiate. The lead man, a tall figure with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, stepped forward. "Senor Blanco sends his regards," he said smoothly. "He also sends a reminder." El Cayman forced a smile. "A reminder of what, exactly?" "That you are alive because he allows it." There was no need for raised voices. no threats laced with profanity. The statement alone was enough to send a chill through the air. Back in town, Dona Rosa was already preparing for the next stage. She knew this wasn't over. The cartel was powerful, yes, but they weren't the only ones with long memories. The man on the other end of her call, he was once just a boy, a scared orphan running from the same violence that now ruled this land. And when that boy had nowhere to go, when his parents had been butchered in the street like animals, it was Dona Rosa who had taken him in. She had fed him when he was starving. She had given him a name when he had none. And now, that boy had grown into the most feared man in Mexico. El Cayman standoff. El Cayman didn't become the leader of this region by backing down. He had built his empire with blood and fire, had crushed countless enemies beneath his boot. He had been feared for years, but today he felt fear himself. Blanco's men didn't stay long. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to send a message that rippled through every layer of his operation. His soldiers were nervous, his lieutenants uneasy. But El Cayman was not about to surrender his control over an old woman's land without a fight. "We need to send our own message," one of his men said that night, his voice low. "If we back down now, we'll look weak." El Cayman said nothing for a long time, watching the smoke curl from the end of his cigar. Finally, he flicked the ash into an empty glass and spoke. "Bring me the old woman." The order sent a ripple through the room. Even his most hardened enforcers hesitated. Nobody wanted to be the one to lay hands on Dona Rosa. Not after what had just happened. Not with Blanco watching. Still, they were cartel men. Orders were orders. That night, 2 blacked-out trucks rumbled down the dirt road, leading to Dona Rosa's farm. Inside, men with rifles sat in tense silence, their fingers twitching near the triggers. They had been ordered to take her, alive, if possible. But they knew better than to expect things to go smoothly. When they arrived, the house was dark, the fields empty. They stepped out cautiously, scanning the land. Then the phone rang. Not theirs. Theirs were dead. No signal, no service. But the landline inside the farmhouse was ringing loud and clear, its sound cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. One of the men swallowed hard before stepping inside. The old rotary phone sat on the table, its cord twisted from years of use. It shouldn't even be working. And yet, the ringing continued. He hesitated, then picked up the receiver. A voice, calm, familiar, terrifying, spoke on the other end. "Go home, boys," it said. "Before you don't have a home to go back to." The line went dead. The enforcer dropped the phone as if it had burned him. His hands trembled. He turned to his partner. But before he could speak, headlights flooded the farmhouse from the road. Not just one set, dozens. Engines rumbled. Tires crunched over dirt, and then as one, the men inside the truck stepped out. Not cartel soldiers. Blanco's men. And standing in the middle of them, untouched, unafraid, was Dona Rosa. Power beyond blood. El Cayman never left his compound that night. He received a call an hour later. "You lost," Blanco's voice said, unhurried, casual. "The land belongs to her. It always has." El Cayman knew there was no arguing, no threats he could make that would hold any weight. He had spent his life terrorizing others, but tonight, he was the one being taught a lesson. The town awoke to silence the next morning. The cartel had disappeared overnight. No bodies, no violence, just a sudden withdrawal, as if they had never been there at all. And Dona Rosa? She simply returned to her land, her movements slow but steady. When Mateo and the other villagers asked her what had happened, she only smiled. Just an old friend repaying a debt. For the first time in years, silence reigned in Dona Rosa's town. No gunshots in the night. No blacked-out trucks rumbling down dirt roads. No whispers of disappearances. It was as if the cartel had vanished overnight. But Dona Rosa knew better. Cartels didn't disappear. They waited. They watched. They licked their wounds and planned their revenge. And El Cayman was not a man who accepted humiliation easily. While his men had backed away after Blanco's intervention, his pride had not. He had spent years building his empire through terror, making himself the only law that mattered. And now one old woman, one frail, wrinkled, stubborn woman, had shattered that image with a single phone call. No, this wasn't over. And so, El Cayman decided to come himself. The cartel leader arrives. It happened 3 nights later. The town was asleep when the convoy arrived. No roaring engines, no careless shouts. This time, the cartel moved like ghosts. 5 black SUVs, their headlights dimmed, rolled slowly through the dirt roads. Armed men poured out, their footsteps muffled against the earth. But unlike before, they didn't go to Dona Rosa's farm. They went to the mayor's house. The mayor had always been a man who bent to the wind, and now the wind was changing again. He awoke to a gun barrel pressed against his forehead, sweat drenching his nightshirt as El Cayman sat calmly in the chair across from him. "I'm losing patience, amigo," the cartel leader said, lighting a cigar. His voice was smooth, almost amused. "An old woman humiliated me. That's not something I can allow." The mayor stammered, nodding frantically. I understand, El Cayman, I do. But Senor Blanco." El Cayman's gaze darkened. "Senor Blanco isn't here. I am." The mayor swallowed. "Then what do you want me to do?" "Simple." El Cayman leaned forward, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. "Bring her to me. The town's betrayal." Morning came with an unease that settled over the town like fog. No one had seen the cartel arrive, but everyone could feel their presence. It was in the way the streets felt too quiet, in the way eyes darted toward the hills where El Cayman's men lurked unseen. The mayor made his move by midday. Dona Rosa was in her fields, tending to the soil as if nothing had changed. She had lived through worse. She knew this was not the time for fear. Then she heard the footsteps. She turned slowly, finding the mayor Mateo and 3 other townspeople standing at her gate. They looked uneasy, guilt pooling in their eyes. "Dona Rosa," the mayor began carefully, "you must come with us." She studied them for a long time. Finally, she nodded. "So you have already chosen your side." "Please," Mateo whispered. His voice was thick with shame. "They'll burn the whole town if you don't go." For a moment, the old woman said nothing. Then she stepped forward. She did not fight, did not argue. She simply went willingly, face to face with the devil. El Cayman was waiting at the edge of town, sitting atop the hood of his SUV as if he had all the time in the world. His men stood around him, guns slung lazily over their shoulders. They weren't afraid. They thought the fight was already won. When Dona Rosa arrived, she didn't cower, didn't shrink. Instead, she looked at the cartel leader with the same steady gaze she had given the land for decades. "You finally come in person," she said, her voice calm. El Cayman smirked. "I wanted to see for myself what makes you so special." Dona Rosa studied him, and for the first time, she saw what lay beneath the surface. He was afraid, not of her, but of what she represented. "You're afraid of losing," she said simply. His smirk faltered. "You think your power is in bullets," she continued. "But I don't need guns to fight you." El Cayman's eyes darkened. "You don't get it, do you? I could have you buried in the hills by nightfall. Then why haven't you?" The words hit harder than any bullet. He could have ordered her dead, could have wiped her off the earth, but he hadn't, because in the shadows, something else was moving. Blanco was watching. And more than that, the town was watching, because for the first time, the people were seeing something they had never seen before, a crack in El Cayman's control. A single old woman had defied him, and if she could, why couldn't they? Power was a fragile thing. It only existed as long as people believed in it. And now, that belief was crumbling. The final deal. El Cayman could feel it slipping. His hold on the town, his reputation. Killing Dona Rosa wouldn't erase that. It would only make it worse. So he did the only thing left. He made a deal. You keep your land, he said, but you stay out of my way. You don't call Blanco again. You don't interfere with my business. Dona Rosa smiled faintly. You've already lost me, Joe. The town will never fear you the same way again. His fist clenched. He hated that she was right. Without another word, he turned, signaled to his men, and drove away. By nightfall, the cartel was gone. For good. A town reborn. The next morning, the town was different. People walked the streets with their heads held high. Doors that had once remained shut in fear now stood open, because for the first time in years, the cartel was not coming back. El Cayman's empire hadn't fallen overnight, but his hold on this town had. And Dona Rosa? She returned to her land, same as before. Her work wasn't done, but she had proven one thing. Some things are stronger than fear. Epilogue. A lesson that echoed. A week later, a package arrived at Dona Rosa's doorstep. No note, no explanation. Inside, a single silver bullet. A warning, or maybe a sign of respect. She placed it on her shelf. Another memory, another battle won. She had seen many men rise and fall. El Cayman was just another name in a long list. And the land, it was still hers, forever.